So walking into a CEO's office and using your voice is great. Walking into a CEO's office with 50 other employees is even better.
Welcome back, everybody. Rich Brubaker, Shanghai-based founder of Collective Responsibility, here today with another episode of the Sustainable Ambassador podcast. Through this series, I speak with sustainable ambassadors about the work they're doing to solve the big environmental, social, and economic challenges that we face. In this episode, I am extremely honored to be joined by Professor Kellie McElhaney, a true ambassador for sustainability and responsible leadership, to join us and talk about her work at the Berkeley Haas School. Kellie is the founding director of the Haas Business School Center for Equity, Gender, and Leadership, and is a leading expert in equity-fluent leadership, value-creating strategies for diversity and inclusion, and corporate social responsibility. And she has, more than anyone else, I think, traversed the various versions of responsible leadership, corporate responsibility, sustainability, and now in the current work that she's doing through the center. So through this conversation, we'll be speaking about the recent rise and discussions around diversity and inclusion in the boardroom, some of the recent cases that we've seen in public of public pushback, but also where brands are making real progress, and the challenges that leaders face finding that balance. So with that, Kellie, welcome to the Sustainable Ambassador podcast. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks, Rich. Thanks so much for having me. It's my honor as well. As you said, my name is Kellie McElhaney, and I'm a professor at the Haas School of Business at UC Berkeley. Our not so humble goal is to graduate 3,000 equity-fluent leaders every year. And by that, we mean not getting into the silos of diversity, justice, sort of really putting ourselves in our own social identity groups, but elevating this up to the larger level of humanity, to be grandiose, but leadership, how I am individually as a leader in whatever organization, be it nonprofit, government, or corporate. But mostly, Rich, is about how I use my power to address barriers for, different groups as these inequities and barriers exist.
I can imagine that there'd be concerns about some of these topics within the business school environment. And I'm curious, how did you approach actually setting up the center? And what were maybe some of the early stakeholders, like professors or students, that you felt you had to engage to get this thing really moving into the traction mode?
I had gone through 2 deans where I had requested that I be able to do this. And each of them in different versions of this format said, this doesn't really fit into the business world. You should be going to the School of Gender Studies or the School of Sociology. Not that they were being a blockade. It just didn't intuitively make sense to them. I think the biggest complaint, first of all, it's always about the money. Is she going to take funding that should be going to core business topics? So there was that. And then the second is really, is this going to diminish our brand in the marketplace? Are we going to be seen as producing students who are too soft, who aren't focused on the bottom line?
How do you teach this in a way that shows that those concerns are mute or at best old thought, and that we're in a new way and this actually generates real value for a business, for a leader?
I mean, it's a great question. It almost gives me a little bit of chills, both out of beautiful memories and sad reality. I'll never forget this moment in class where I was teaching the business case, right? I had taught it in sustainability. It just has always been the entrance point. And so we were talking about the data in the classroom. And I had this African-American male student, and he said, and I literally remember this, he said, "This is whack. I mean, do you really need to prove that there's a business case to hire me as a person who comes from a diverse identity group?" And it was this kind of show-stopping moment for me. And I made a decision right there, Rich. I'm not going to talk about the business case anymore, because he's absolutely right. I'm now becoming part of the problem, because I am perpetuating that there needs to be a business case to invest in a Black man or a transgender woman. It's now talking about the business case. The most solid business case right now is access to talent. As countless studies show that this generation cares absolutely deeply about working for a company who has a commitment to diversity. They're interested in working for a company where they see themselves in leadership on teams. So the business case for access to top talent and retention of top talent, and then unlocking the brilliance of the talent that they hire, it's squarely there.
I mean, for me, it's very much about, we're in a transition period where we're fighting over different ideas about the future. Do you find that there, within the spectrum of topics that represent your center, are there topics that are now completely agreed upon? And are there topics that you find are still debated?
It's a very volatile time for things all things diversity, a lot of political headwinds, and
Yeah.
companies don't want to push back against politicians.
How does this impact business?
The two lines of messaging that I'm hearing at the CEO level, it's I'm afraid to mess up. So I'm afraid to get out there on the platform and say anything
Yeah.
because I have been told I'm fully complicit for the problem today around white men still being largely in charge. That's kind of going away, but I think the message that I hear that it's a really hard one to respond to is if I spoke up about what's happening in the United States, I'd have to be speaking 3 times a day.
Yeah.
I mean, the issues just keep coming at me. And so
Right.
how do I choose what to speak up for and what to not? Because somebody's always offended, right? If I speak up
Yeah.
against something, I'm alienating this customer group.
Yeah.
If I don't speak up about something, I'm alienating this customer group. And by and large, my response is 2 things. One, if you have stated core values and something is happening in the world that goes against what you are proselytizing as your stated core values, then speak up. Number 2, if this is having a significant impact on your employees, you have no choice but to speak up.
With that in mind, then, what's the role you see of academia at this time, facilitating, researching, training on these issues?
One of the age-old arguments in my world in academia, be it through ESG, sustainability, and DEI, is should we be offering separate classes in these topics, or do you bring these issues into an economics class, a marketing class? And of course, inarguably, the second is the right model. So we're trying to sort of do whatever we can. So it is the classroom, and the second is research. We're a top tier research institution. And so, a Berkeley economist comes out with a study that shows that it is economically advantageous to really bring in a diverse supply chain or a diverse, workforce. So it is the leaders we are developing as well as the research that we are producing that is accessible to the business audience.
When it comes to brands and the challenges they faced, how much of this is just kind of people being shitty? They really view ESG as a threat to their identity or to whatever it might be. How much of it is the brands not understanding their consumers and going a bit too far too early? And then how much of it is like the brands doing that, but then realizing it's too early, we're going to draw back? And I'm curious, like, what's the spectrum of kind of, if you're going to write a business case right now around these scandals, what's the spectrum that you see? And what do you, if you were to look out, say 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, do you think that we'll still have the same paradigm and the same challenges being thrown at us? Or will we have actually cleared through some of those hurdles and gotten a little bit further down the track?
What is happening on the brand level, and let's take Bud Light and, the transgender woman that they sent the can to, that is such a perplexing case. And it went much more negative than even I thought. Most of these thoughts historically have been a blip with no impact on market share. Light is one of our premier cases of where it had massive impact, not only on the right, who were offended that we would put they would put a transgender woman's face on a beer can. Now, they didn't even sell that in the marketplace. They simply sent it to her during the Final Four or whatever, the basketball tournament. And the loudest, ugliest voice, to use your word of shitty, was Kid Rock, who was quite jarring, right? Given what's happening with gun shootings in the US, he literally puts out a pyramid of Bud Light cans and takes a gun and shoots through them. Got a lot of traction, right? That's the sort of stuff that gets traction immediately. So not only did they alienate whatever you want to call the Kid Rock contingent, they ultimately alienated the LGBTQ plus because it was just so disparate to their market share. They had never really tried to bring in this LGBTQ plus or these DEI oriented folks. So it was very out of brand.
Is this a great example of a brand actually not having the value, but signaling to the market that they are of value to that community? And it's just going pear-shaped.
Very pear-shaped fast. It wasn't.
They lost like 30% of their market share or something in a month. It's stunning. But is that deserved because they really weren't an ally? They really weren't part of the community?
Absolutely it was. I hate to say it because I don't want to give in to the right or whoever that was. But it was just not well integrated. It did not, fit into one of their core values. The only thing I'd say was it was started with a morsel of a good thought, which was Bud Light was losing market share or just really sinking as a brand. And a new marketing leader came in and said, look, we are attracting the frat bro and we want
Mhm.
to expand our market share so that we can sell more beer. So it
Yeah.
had a morsel of a good idea, but it was executed horrifically.
Yeah.
So they did deserve what they got. And the fact is, that was March. Where are we now?
Mhm.
September, and it's still showing up on the front pages. Bars are still
Yeah.
not serving Bud Light in various parts of the country.
But I guess as a counterexample, I'd use Nike, which was during the Colin Kaepernick thing. They backed him, and
Mhm.
everyone said it would be a Bud Light moment for them. But in reality, they saw more market share because they understood their market. Are there topics where you can be really feeding into this transition? And you can look, I know you don't get it, white dude, but these groups do. Is that where you see brands making really big investments now, or realigning?
I think that it's separating the wheat from the chaff. I think the
Mhm.
companies who were in it for the right reasons, Nike and historically have been in it for a long time are still there. I'm not saying they're not
Yeah.
shrinking their budgets, but look at the economy right now. But to compare for a second, Nike versus Budweiser, the brilliance of Nike is that they don't pull back. They didn't pull back on that Colin Kaepernick campaign. In fact, they amplified it. They gave Colin a much bigger platform along with the
Mhm.
other athletes who stood alongside of Colin. They were also true to their core competency, right? Nike's core competency is sports. So what they chose to the vehicle, the channel by which they were fighting back was through sports. And that was just a great match of competency and how they chose to take a stand on an issue. Whereas Budweiser had no previous support for LGBTQ rights. It wasn't part
Right.
of their core competency. So, and it would be hard for me to actually make a link between alcohol and transgender rights.
How would you approach understanding how leadership success is tied to these issues, or how successful leaders make different decisions?
You can't divorce yourself from your history. We know a lot
Mm.
about the present from looking at the history. Now, that said, I'm a huge proponent and believer in transformation. But
Right.
what I tell a corporate leader, what I do tell corporate leaders to do is learn from the past, look at what are your core business objectives, because this has to support a core business objective, but also look at the values that you espouse, that you've promised to your employees as your social contract, and really select an issue both that fits into your core values, your core promise, both to the marketplace, but very
Yeah.
critically to employees, and also look at areas in which you can have an impact. I mean, not every issue is going to be the issue that every CEO should take on. And every
Exactly.
CEO cannot take on every issue. So you do have to have this conversation around the emotional side of it. But I am running a business. And if I drive my business into the ground, which is what happened in that, one brand in Bud,
Right.
those two individuals are gone. So it's proof right
Yeah.
there that I can't do this in a way that makes sense for
Yeah.
my business
Well,
objectives, fits my competencies, then I can't do it.
where do you see we can make progress right now on these issues in the boardroom, in companies, with consumers? Like, where is the pockets of opportunity now after these crises passed?
What I know to be true about my world is the more diverse voices at the table, the better you're going to perform on diversity. I'll just point to me. If you have a group of straight white women in a business leadership meeting talking about what we can do for pride or LGBTQ plus, it's not going to be an authentic strategy because I don't have that lived experience voice at my table. We also have to talk about inclusion for all. So inclusion is not just for certain subsets of the population and then, alienating the majority, which we are doing in the United States.
Mhm.
My mantra now as I'm out there teaching, talking on stages, is it is inclusion for all. And the
Yeah.
name, shame, blame game, absolutely ineffective.
What you were just talking about is really, for me, like when I hear like the internal culture of an organization, but also of communities themselves, right? Like, what's important to us? Who are we? How can we fight for others? How can we fight for ourselves? And then you can go out and you can make progress, hopefully collaboratively, across the silos of everyone screaming for their own issue. And I'm curious, if you look out 10 years from now, do you think that we'll still be where we are now? Because we've had a lot of progress in different rights categories, women, be it color, be it, I mean, we're seeing so many opening up, but it takes a generation.
I do think we're going to be in a better place in 5 or 10 years. I think that it's going to be ugly to get there.
Mhm.
So, it's not going to be pretty. I think there's going to be more and more divisiveness. It's happening. And the second thing I want to say with a caveat is this younger generation, I don't know that looking to this generation to solve the problems that happened under our watch is necessarily the right strategy, because I do know unequivocally that this generation is experiencing significant climate stress, diversity, equity, inclusion stress, gun violence stress, police brutality stress. I mean, if you think of what they've seen versus what you and I saw in the 70s.
Yeah, it's vastly different.
Astronomically different. So
yeah, I constantly say when I'm in front of young people that, first off, I apologize because this is going to be brought to you whether you want it or not. And my job is to help inspire you and equip you to get a little bit further than my generation did. And this is going to be my last question to you. You're talking to these radical deviants, potential radical deviants, aspiring radical deviants. Like, what advice would you give them about skill sets and mindsets that they'll need to deploy in the future to really deliver on 10, 20 years going forward on the issues that are important?
The reality of the stress on younger people who are focused on creating change is very real. So the first thing is self-care. I mean, Audre Lorde says the most politically radical thing I can do is self-care. So I do believe that. To not go it alone. I mean, one of, I think that the characteristics that is the most dangerous that most change agents tend to express or possess is this Lone Ranger, this a thing that we can change the world, and we're going to do it alone. So collaboration and strength in numbers is number two, critical. But using your voice, it is amazing to me how many companies have literally taken on an issue because one employee spoke up and made a very compelling argument of why and how we should take this issue on, and said, let me be a part of the change. So, I just tell my students, use your voice. You do have power. So walking into a CEO's office and using your voice is great. Walking into a CEO's office with 50 other employees is even better.